When Daniel's emergency appendix surgery left him bedridden for 2 weeks, his mother Eleanor insisted on moving in to help, framing it as a temporary arrangement that would only last until he could walk without wincing. I welcomed her with genuine gratitude at first, because juggling his recovery, work, and our toddler alone had already begun to exhaust me. An extra pair of hands felt like a relief rather than a burden. She arrived with 2 suitcases, claiming she'd pack light, since she'd only be staying a few weeks, settling into our guest room with quiet efficiency that initially struck me as helpful rather than calculated. I had no idea, in those first days, that temporary meant something entirely different in Eleanor's vocabulary than it did in mine. The first month passed reasonably smoothly. Eleanor cooking dinners, helping with our son's school pickup, gradually inserting herself into routines I had built carefully over years of trial and error. I noticed small shifts I initially dismissed as harmless, like her rearranging my kitchen cabinets for efficiency or quietly replacing items in our pantry with brands she preferred without asking. Daniel, still recovering and grateful for his mother's help, brushed off my mild concerns as me being too sensitive during a stressful time, a phrase that would become uncomfortably familiar over the following months. I told myself it was temporary, that once Daniel fully recovered, life would return to normal, and Eleanor would return to her own home an hour away. By the 3rd month, Eleanor had stopped mentioning any timeline for leaving, instead talking vaguely about how much she enjoyed being close to family, and how lonely her own house felt since her husband passed years earlier. I understood her loneliness, genuinely sympathized with it, but understanding someone's pain doesn't obligate you to permanently restructure your household around it without conversation or consent. Daniel, fully recovered by then, seemed strangely unbothered by his mother's extended presence, perhaps relieved to have additional support, perhaps avoiding the uncomfortable conversation of asking her to finally go home. I started bringing it up gently, asking when she planned to return to her own place, only to be met with deflections and gentle guilt trips about how family should help family whenever it suited her narrative. The breaking point arrived in month 6, on an ordinary Tuesday evening, when Eleanor called a family meeting in our living room, sitting Daniel and me down like errant children rather than the homeowners we actually were. She announced, with startling confidence, that she decided to make her stay permanent, explaining she'd already begun looking into selling her own house, since it made more financial sense for everyone involved. Then, almost as an afterthought, she informed me that she decided I should move into the smaller guest bedroom, since she felt the master suite would better accommodate her need for quiet and space given her age and health considerations. I sat there in stunned silence, processing the audacity of being told which room I'd sleep in my own house by someone who had been a guest for 6 months. What Eleanor didn't know, and what Daniel had conveniently never mentioned to her, was that the house we lived in wasn't jointly owned the way she assumed. 2 years before our marriage, I had purchased property entirely with my own savings and inheritance, structuring the deed specifically in my name alone after a financial advisor recommended protecting certain assets before marriage for tax and estate purposes. Daniel had always been comfortable with this arrangement, contributing to the mortgage informally while never holding legal ownership, an arrangement Eleanor had simply never been told about because it never seemed relevant to discuss with extended family. Sitting there listening to her confidently reassigned bedrooms in the house, she had no legal claim to whatsoever, felt almost surreal in its misplaced entitlement. I let her finish her announcement completely, watching Daniel's uncomfortable silence beside her, clearly unwilling to correct his mother's assumptions even as she planned out our living arrangements as though I had no say in the matter. Then calmly, I informed her that the house was solely in my name, that I had purchased it before our marriage, and that any decisions about room assignments, extended stays, or permanent living arrangements would be made by me, not unilaterally announced over a family meeting I hadn't been consulted on. The color drained from Eleanor's face almost instantly, her carefully constructed plan crumbling the moment she realized the foundation she'd built her assumptions on simply didn't exist. Daniel, finally finding his voice, tried smoothing things over by suggesting we discuss this more calmly later, which only highlighted exactly how long he'd allowed this dynamic to develop without advocating for either my authority in our own home or honest communication with his mother. I told him plainly, in front of Eleanor. That 6 months of silently watching me get sidelined in my own household wasn't something we could simply discuss away with vague reassurances. Eleanor attempted to backtrack, claiming she'd misunderstood the arrangement, but the damage her confident overreach had already revealed exactly how she viewed her place in our family hierarchy, above mine, despite owning nothing within those walls. The following weeks involved difficult conversations about boundaries that should have been established the day Eleanor moved in temporarily. Conversations Daniel and I should have had to get along before his mother ever felt comfortable enough to start reassigning bedrooms. I gave Eleanor a firm but reasonable timeline to find alternative housing. 2 months. Enough time to make arrangements without the urgency of being suddenly displaced, but clear enough that the temporary arrangement had definitively ended. Daniel, finally understanding the position his passive avoidance had put me in, began actively helping his mother search for a small apartment nearby, a compromise that allowed her proximity to family without permanent residence in a house she had no claim to. Eleanor moved out 3 weeks later, the relationship between us noticeably cooler but functional, built now on clearer boundaries rather than the assumed entitlement she'd operated under for 6 months. Daniel and I spent considerable time afterward rebuilding the kind of direct communication we should have maintained from the beginning, instead of allowing extended family dynamics to quietly erode decisions that should have always been ours alone. Looking back, I understand now that temporary arrangements without clear boundaries inevitably expand to fill whatever space they're given, especially when one person assumes silence means agreement rather than simply exhausted tolerance, and that owning your home means nothing if you don't also firmly own your voice within it.